The Constitutional Court has ruled that a new tender process must be conducted in the grant case involving Net1, UEPS, it used to be called Aplitech, and the banking group Absa. Anthony Norton from Nortons joins us on the line. Anthony, you were representing Absa in this case. Just in real layman's terms, we're becoming a lot more familiar as South Africans with what happens in the courts, but what happened in this case?
Well, this has been a bit of a long-running saga, which has gone all the way from the High Court to the Supreme Court and now ultimately to the Constitutional Court. And really what it was in essence about was a review of SASSA's decision to award the 10 billion rand social grants tender to CPS. Ultimately, the Constitutional Court found last year that the award of the social grants tender to CPS was irregular and unlawful. And today's judgment was what was an appropriate remedy in the circumstances. And what the court has done is to order a fresh tender process and has told SASSA that it must initiate a new process within 30 days of today's order, and that the new tender must be for a period of 5 years.
So, in other words, Net1 has lost its biggest bit of business.
Well, not really. What the court has done is it said, look, to avoid any disruption to social grant payments, the contract will remain in place for the time being until a new tender process has been conducted. And once the new tender process has been conducted, SASSA will then take a decision as to whether to award a new tender. And if it did take a decision at that stage to award a new tender, and the party to whom it was going to award a new tender was not CPS, then clearly the contract would change. But for the time being, that contract remains in place in order to avoid disruption of social grant payments.
How long could it last for, this temporary period that Net1 has the tender?
Well, the court has, in essence, ensured that I think that the new tender process, must be initiated within 30 days. So within a month of today's order, a new tender process must be initiated by SASSA. The court hasn't prescribed exactly how long that will take, but obviously that must be done within a reasonably quick duration. So, I think we're talking a couple of months for a new tender process to be initiated and completed. And then, SASSA will need to report back to the court about the outcome of the tender process.
The stock market is usually very smart about these things. Net1's share price is up 50% in the past year. There's somebody betting somewhere that they're not going to lose it.
It's difficult for me to comment on practicalities like this. I think what the court was at pains to ensure today was that there's going to be a fair and transparent new tender process going forward. And, obviously the expectation is that the most competitive and efficient tender will ultimately win. And, it's difficult, obviously, for me to comment on who that will be, but I think that's clearly what the court's primary intention is.
What were these irregularities?
Well, I think there were a couple. I think the first one was that the tender criteria was not clear. So when SASSA specified the tender criteria, it didn't make it clear to all of the bidders exactly what it required in terms of the tender specifications. That was obviously a primary issue. The second major irregularity was that CPS's black empowerment partners were never assessed by SASSA. So although it was indicated that they would take over some of the operational aspects of the tender, SASSA never evaluated their ability to do so. And those were the two primary irregularities that the court identified.
So it isn't bribery and corruption as one might jump to that conclusion? Correct.
There was no findings by the court of bribery and corruption, but clearly the court found that the irregularities that were identified were sufficiently serious to vitiate the tender process and to ensure that a new tender process should be conducted.
Now, obviously, your client, Absa, must be pretty confident that they'd have a good go at getting the tender next time round. Otherwise, why go through so much trouble?
Well, I think it was based on two issues. I think obviously from a commercial point of view, I think obviously they do feel that they've got a very good offering, and that they have got a good prospects of getting a new tender. But I think there's also a more important principled issue in this case, which was that it was very, very important in the context particularly of very large public procurement tenders of this kind that fair and lawful tender processes are followed, and that, if major institutions in this country like Absa and Allpay don't ensure that lawful processes are followed, then that sets a very, very bad precedent going forward. So I think there was a very, very important issue of principle for the future state of public procurement in this country that was at stake in this case.
Indeed, but shareholders don't really care that much about principle. They care about the bottom line, and I'm sure that's what motivated Absa more. Anthony, just to close off with, how long have they been fighting this in court, and what might it have cost both parties?
Well, this case has been running for over 2.5 years through 3 courts. And considerable legal expenditure, I think, on all sides in order to get to today's a court decision.
Millions or tens of millions?
Millions is I think, a fair reflection.
Anthony Norton, founder and director of Nortons.